Hello and welcome back to Fullerton College's pre-press class. This is Professor Ben Hewitt. Today we're going to talk about image capture, hardware and software for the PIA Pre-Press Trainees Manual, section 4.4. In the next video or three, maybe two if we're very lucky, we're going to look at the different processes involved in making a good high-quality scan. We're going to look at different types of things about image capture. That is resolution, interpolated resolution, and dynamic range. We're going to look at CCD and CMOS, scan and photo technologies. Those are the actual sensors involved. And we're going to look at the different types of file formats that digital cameras use. Let's jump in. Digital images are captured using digital devices. The thing is, there's not actually that much difference electronically speaking, between a digital camera and a digital scanner. The sensors and a lot of the software are quite similar, in some cases the same, but the difference is in the actual physical glass, hopefully, sometimes plastic, glass optics. In that, as you know, a digital camera is a camera and it can capture images throughout the world. And a digital scanner is basically a digital camera fixed to a table with one single focal length, which is the distance between the sensor and the mostly paper. I'm going to call it substrate, the paper or the image you put onto it. It's focused directly on its scan bed. So whatever you put on the scanner, whether it's paper or your face because you're being silly, or other body parts because you really want to get fired somewhere, that is exactly how far it's able to scan, no farther. But a digital camera can be focused to different ranges and depths away. Flatbed scanners typically use a charge coupled device, a CCD, sensor suite to scan the data. A lot of them have their own software, which is to say they have their own computer application that controls them and brings the image in to import onto your computer. Other ones you can use plugins for, and you can import them through Photoshop. You'll never guess which method I prefer. Hint, Photoshop. Okay, so flatbed scanning. So when you scan, one of the other advantages of scanning over photography, unless you have a really good setup for photography, is that scanning also gives you the light necessary. Yeah, it's fluorescent, but it'll use the different types of color temperatures and what do you call them? Spectrums available depending on the price of the scanner to illuminate the object being scanned evenly, consistently, and very well. The CCD array will then capture the light reflected off of it back through that glass through a couple of mirrors onto it. So optical resolution, that is the actual resolution of the scanner. That's how detailed the actual sensor and the actual optics on the machine are capable of doing it. And this is based off of the size of the CCD element and these stepping increments, how slow, how big. One of those things about a scan is, to you it looks, if you ever used a scanner, and hopefully you have, when you see the light bar go along and it's scanning and it's moving from one side of the bed to the other, to you it looks continuous. But it's not a video recorder. In fact, even video recorders do something similar. It's actually taking steps every part of a second as it moves along, taking lots of small images of different slices of that picture. It's actually taking sometimes hundreds or thousands of individual photos of the same document as it moves along at different points, and then it stitches them together in its software. So the size of the stepping increment also tells you how good a scan you're going to get. Also, note, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that fast is bad, but typically, rule of thumb type stuff, faster scanners that move really quickly aren't getting as many in between images as it goes. But again, that's not always true, and technology is improving, so credit where due there. Also, the accuracy of the depth of field and how well it's focused, and then the mechanical precision of the scanner's moving parts. Because it's taking images that are timed along a moving track, it has to move very consistently. And if there's like a chip in a gear somewhere, you're in a lot of trouble. Other characteristics. Scanners also have something called dynamic range, which is basically how bright and how dark can it see. That's the limits. What's the brightest white the scanner can record, and what's the darkest dark that the scanner can record? There's also color accuracy, and typically any scanner is going to reproduce the same color differently. Even if you're talking to, and this is one of those things where we think about things in our head using a word, but that word doesn't really exist in the real world, guys. And that word is identical. If you buy two identical scanners, they're not truly identical. They were made by different people or the same person, even at different times in the same factory, but they're assembled differently. There's no such thing as identical. So even if you have two of the same make and model bought from the same store, you bought two boxes of whatever scanner it is from the electronics place, whichever one is still open that you can go to, and you put them out and you scan, you're going to get different colors out of them. Some of them will darken midtones. Some of them will reproduce flesh tones better than others. Some will have very saturated colors. Some will have very desaturated colors. It always happens a little bit different. In fact, I should say that the consistency between scanners on trying to get good color information out of them is so completely wild that it was in fact a scanner salesman who came up with the G7 color management system, which is now standard for American printing for color consistency, because Don had to figure out a way of making scanners actually, well, I shouldn't say making them, of taming these wild scanners in front of clients and prospective clients while he's showing them to them. Because if you show someone a scanner and you go ahead and do a scan and it comes out looking awful, you're not selling that scanner. So he had to find a way of making consistent scans. And we'll talk a little bit about that here and a lot more about it later. I've actually been trained, although I'm not qualified as a professional on that anymore. That has expired. But still, I'm probably talking too much. Let's move on. It was necessary to rein these guys in and to make them consistent. So the scanning software gives you control over things. You're able to figure out what kind of resolution you want, with the maximum being whatever the maximum optical is, and then also down to less if you want a smaller file size. You can control the color space it's looking for and saving the file in. Profiles, we'll talk about another time. Gamma and contrast, unsharp masking, these are all things you can do in the scanning software. And this is very similar to the Don Hutch method here for G7. Grayscales have been a photographic tool since early in photography. It's just a piece of paper with different levels of white to black, often stepped about 15 or 20 times, depending on the scale you get. You tap it on for a scanner, you need a reflective and a transparent one. Reflective means it's on paper, transparent means it's on clear, so you can see through it. And by having known steps of gray levels, you can calibrate the printer to achieve them. Photographs and slides, if you're talking about older slides. See, slides, I should mention here, very old printing for us now, 30 plus years ago. The file storage method for a print job was not actually a digital computer file. It was just starting to be that. Let's say 40 years ago, a little bit farther back, 40 years ago, early 80s, even before that, late 70s, early 80s, and before that into the 60s. When you were using film-based plate making for offset lithography, which is you made a film negative or a film positive, depending on the plate, and you exposed the plate through a piece of film to create the exposure that was going to be what you printed. Everything was done optically and analog. So if you wanted to store a file and you wanted to print it again in the future, you didn't save all the paste up you did. You didn't save all the sheets of paper you glued together and photographed. Oh, no, you'd save a slide. You could expose your film as a slide, and that would be something you could save, and you could use it later. Anyways, so early on in digital printing and digital layout, one of the things that had to be done was people had to scan slides to bring their analog file storage, their physical, actual film piece that was their print file, and convert that into a digital image on a computer. And to do that, you had to scan. Scanning was a much larger part of printing than it currently is. It used to be the bee's knees because everyone was in the process of converting from analog to digital. But now we've been solidly inside the digital world for so long that scanners and there used to be a job of a scanner operator. You'd work for a print shop and your entire job would be to scan things. Hopefully those people found ways to train in other parts of the job or were ready to retire, because that is really not a job anymore. Scanning is not just something you kind of do sometimes when you need to. Anyways, all that was to say, slides and photographs, that's why slides are on there, were continuous tone. And you had to be able to get halftone dots. So you had to establish a correlation between continuous and halftone dots using a grayscale. So you'd have to be able to scan and make these do the same thing, so that number 3 on the left looks like number 3 on the right. This is a way of calibrating your system. So to optimize a scanner, you'd start by scanning the grayscale, then you'd print out the grayscale and output device, and you'd evaluate it. You basically scan it in and print it out and compare the original that you scanned to the output one to see how similar they were. And you'd be able to calibrate for the differences, make changes to it so that they look the same. This is, again, somewhat similar to the process of G7 color calibration, color management, I should say, that's currently practiced throughout the United States. The only reason it's not worldwide is some other companies in Europe have some competing versions that they really would like to see, and they don't want to see us Yankees overtaking them in printing. Bit late for that. But anyways, you adjust the gamma and the curves, and you make sure that the contrast and the gray balance stay there consistently. And once you've calibrated it, you use it for all your scans for a while, although you need to calibrate your system every once in a while to make sure that it's not falling out of calibration. So scan the grayscale in RGB mode. Whoops, it scrolled up on me. Then you output it and you print it out. And you can compare the two, you evaluate them. You want to match it up as close as you possibly can from one to the other. You can also do this using advanced measuring devices such as densitometers and spectrophotometers. I just love that word. And you can check with a measurement device that will actually sense how much light is being reflected or transmitted to see if it's the same. And you can match it as well as possible. Then you will go ahead and you adjust the curves to make it so that if it was too bright, you make everything darker. If it's too dark, you make everything brighter. If the midtones were off, you adjust the middle of that little curve. The curve being, if you look on the right of this image here, on this little screenshot, there's a graph going up and going to the right. And there's a curved line in the middle of it. And you can adjust the shape of that line. And the shape of that line is actually telling you, when I see this much light, how much light should I put on the computer? It's graphing input versus output of different levels of light to dark that the scanner is seeing throughout an image. And once you get the settings nailed, use them forever. You really only need to set it up the first time, although it's good to calibrate every once in a while to make sure that things aren't falling apart or aging or not working as well as they used to. But overall, you set up a scanner once and it's good to go. So gamma. If anyone has played computer games, and if you've ever set up a modern TV, you're probably familiar with what gamma is. So gamma is a formula of depicting the curve between 2 points in math, and what it's used for in monitors and TVs and scanners is it's talking about the curve between lightest and darkest image on your screen. If you ever played a new computer game you just installed, like I used to when I was a kid, in the setup screen, you'd adjust the gamma and it would give you a series of tones, and you would have to manually do the slider to make it so that white looks like white, black looks like black, and you can actually see all the colors in between. You could also do this to rob yourself of the ambiance of some games to make them playable. Or in more recent terms, I guess I should say, I had to screw with the gamma on my TV when The Mandalorian first came out, because it was a dark show. I don't mean dark like, oh man, it's so dark and gritty. I mean like physically, actually, measurably dark. The first couple episodes I had difficulty watching on my TV because the slightest light from anywhere else in the house, and it looked like I was just watching a blank screen and listening to a podcast about Star Wars. Anyways, so you adjust those until you can actually see things, and you want to get a good, measurable, even step between the different colors and the different levels of light to dark. So positive gamma means the middle colors are made brighter, and the negative gamma makes the midtones look darker. There's also a way of cheating on a game called Deus Ex I grew up with that famously is quite dark. It's like playing a game in shades of black. Excellent game though, a lot of fun. So desktop scanners typically want to start with about 1.8, which means that you are making the midtones a little bit brighter, because the midtones tend to go dark in a scan. So contrast is also looking at the degree of tonal gradation between lightest and darkest. You're trying to find how different is the lightest from the darkest, and what kind of steps are going on there. So this is tone reproduction. I'm going to have to stop here and go to video number 2 in a moment. So we're getting kind of long, and I'm sorry. I'm trying not to yak us to death on this one. Stay tuned for video number 2 on hardware and software.